Hello, I'm Kenneth Cassar, Senior Curator for the Inquisitor's Palace, and today I'll be speaking about some of my favorite items from the Inquisitor's Palace, porcelain finds dating from the 18th century. Picking just one artifact was indeed a challenge for me. In fact, I didn't manage, and I'm here presenting fragments, porcelain fragments from two separate sets, pertaining to daily life within the Inquisitor's Palace. Well, I consider myself to be extremely lucky to be working in such a context. In fact, the Inquisitor's Palace ranks amongst the spaces at an 18th century center of power, which holds volumes of information. We have three main sources of information: the building itself, and we are very lucky that it survived practically intact. We also have archives of documents speaking of daily life within the palace. So it's not just inquisitorial archives pertaining to the spiritual tribunal, but there are also a lot of information. There is a lot of information of what was happening between these walls here. And luckily enough, archaeology is also giving us some feedback. In fact, these finds date from an excavation which started in 1998, and we are very lucky that now all the three main sources are combining, are matching to narrate a wonderful story: the Inquisitor's own presence and his daily life within the palace itself. So here I'm presenting fragments from two sets pertaining to life within the Inquisitor's Palace. First and foremost, we have fragments at least of 4 plates from a dinner set coming from a Tuscan production, from the Doccia area, which is practically known as the Ginori production. One of the more important production houses, which is still active nowadays. This is basically thanks to the research carried out by Nathaniel Kutayar, a colleague of ours from the archaeological section. We managed to establish that this was a very popular motif referred to Agorofani Rossi, referring to the flowers, which we can still see elegantly decorating these plates, which was very popular in the 1760s. So the very fact that we managed to find during archaeological excavations starting in 1998 fragments of these plates is in itself indicative that most probably here we are speaking of the porcelain which the Inquisitor himself was actually using. We also have fragments from a coffee set, both cups and also some saucers, which again date from the 18th century, the mid-18th century, and these are decorated with a lovely scatter of strawberries. Probably again, it's Italian production dating from the late 1700s, and in itself is indicative of life within the palace. It's important to keep in mind that basically when we're speaking of porcelain, nowadays it might be common stuff for us, but back in the 18th century this was high status. Porcelain was considered as white gold. Porcelain in itself was indeed very much sought after. In fact, it was originally a Chinese production coming from the Orient, and it took quite a while until Europe managed to crack the recipe, and we find the first production houses in the early 18th century starting producing porcelain in Europe. So these might be wonderful items in themselves, but they speak volumes of life within the palace. We tend to look at the Inquisitor in his strict role as supreme judge of the spiritual tribunal, but in actual fact, Inquisitors were patrons of the arts, were patrons of a wonderful palace, and in their capacity of apostolic delegates, in other terms ambassadors for the Vatican, ritual greeting and conspicuous consumption was at the order of the day. So Inquisitors used to greet their guests here, and obviously they wanted to impress. That is what conspicuous consumption is all about. Exhibiting access, exhibiting status and power. And this Inquisitor managed to attain not just by furnishing this palace with wonderful furniture pieces, 18th century decorative friezes, tapestries, all of which we find references in a number of inventories, but he wanted to impress his guests also by presenting sophisticated food in sophisticated porcelain wares. In fact, we do find references of a room from the 1750s onwards, referred to as a credenza, where to store tableware. And we find references to due armadi grandi per argenti e porcellana e due armadi piccoli per conservare cristalli. In other terms, the Inquisitor had a room specifically dedicated to the storage of tableware, through which he managed to impress, obviously, his visitors and his important guests. We also managed to trace some contemporary pieces which are not in a fragmentary, not of a fragmentary nature, which help us obviously visualize what these plates must have looked like they were still intact. Obviously, our idea is to include more of these fragments within the current experience in the Inquisitor's Palace, which is all the more looking into the aspect of a historic house. We are very lucky to have all this information. Now we should put it forward to the general public to appreciate not just the building in itself, but the volumes of history which the archives speak of, and obviously which such finds can actually illustrate.